Welcome to this session of Gabelli Forward. It is Monday, the 27th of July, 2020, and I am David Gauci. For the past 10 years, I have had the privilege of serving on the faculty of the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham University. Today, we shall be discussing globalization during a pandemic. When I was first asked to consider assembling a panel just 2 months ago, the proposed topic was globalization after a pandemic. Well, Mother Nature was not through with showing us what globalization looks like from her point of view as the pandemic is still with us. And here we all are trying to make sense of what it means for business and for society at large as well. We shall devote the next hour to looking at this topic from distinct perspectives. Please, as you follow along from the panelists, note questions and send them by the chat function to us. And at the very end of the exercise, the panel today, we will send you an automatic poll so you can give us your sense of how things went. But let me introduce the three panelists who will be joining us today. Jonathan Storey, who had an illustrative career at INSEAD, which is the largest and arguably the most entrepreneurial business school in Fontainebleau, France, served as a professor of political economy and held the Shell Fellowship in Economic Transformation. Jonathan joins us today from his home in Salzburg, Austria. The second panelist is David M. Lampton, who goes by Mike, who has appeared widely in the press and is a respected scholar of China. He was or is Professor Emeritus and formerly was the Hyman Professor and the Director of China Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. David Lampton joins us today from his home in Washington, D.C. And then our third panelist is David Nagel, who has had a long and varied career in the oil and gas industry as an executive vice president. This took him to North Africa, to the headquarters of BP in London, and finally in a position managing the Washington, D.C. office of BP just before his retirement. After his retirement, Dave Nagel co-founded Forum 2100 with a mission to create a diverse global community that works to transcend today's polarized public discourse about energy sources and uses, and that endeavors to identify a portfolio of business-based innovations that solve real-world energy problems. So first of all, before we get started, what is our reference point or our anchor in describing globalization? Where do we start? We are all probably familiar with the globalizing activities of the colonial period, for example, and that was motivated by a mercantilist logic. Although the colonialism has now faded, artifacts of its consequences persist. Uncomfortable contemporary examples of this are as varied as the unrest in Hong Kong and the Black Lives Matters protests all around the world. So in thinking about how we adapt to the pandemic that is with us now, we really should consider transition paths into brave new futures and remember that our choices may have lingering consequences. But the paradigm that we probably need to acknowledge for contemporary discussion of globalization has its roots in the end of World War II. And it was the attempts on the part of the victors of World War II to set a protocol to manage a new world order of heightened coordination that replaced the belligerent contests among the various states, and that was Bretton Woods. It hasn't always been smooth sailing, to say the least, as we have collectively experienced a sequence of disruptions along the path to today. And these disruptions have challenged us to adapt. Most recently, the digital disruption of advancing computation and communication technologies has really contributed to changing the way that each of us relates to the world and how we interact with each other. But it is not technology alone that has disrupted our world. In the 1980s and the first half of the 1990s, there were global disruptions of all kinds. On one hand, we had liberalizing trade to enhance economic interdependencies among states that could otherwise consider engaging in armed conflict. On the other hand, we had the fall of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany and a range of European treaties to formalize the relationships of European states under the umbrella of the EU. And we probably should also acknowledge a disruption associated with a critical resource, namely oil, in the so-called Arab oil crisis of the early 1970s. And its consequences now seem to have morphed into a heightened concern about imminent disruption associated with climate change. In short, it's complicated. So it would seem that what the person in business needs now more than ever is to cultivate an ability to learn how to learn. A corollary to this would be to cultivate an appreciation of intellectual controversy, recognizing that individuals in different contexts around the world may reason from distinct bases of knowledge or experience. So now let's turn to our panel and see what they have to say. We'll begin with Jonathan Story. Jonathan, you're sitting there in Austria. A lot has been going on in Europe over the past decades, but actually even within the last week. Well, how do you respond to this issue of globalization during a pandemic?
Well, I asked myself the question, are we looking forward to a restoration of normalcy, in which case the question is what was normal, or are we moving forward to something new? And of course, actually, the way I phrased it implies that it's somewhere in the middle. But I'd like to make a remark on that, with that regard, on Europe, and perhaps a follow-up, if I've got time, on the rest of the world. The major meeting of the last week in Europe has led to an agreement between the 27 member states that the Commission will be able to mutualize debt. The EU will be able to mutualize debt and issue Euro bonds in the EU's name. This is significant because it implies that the EU now has a sort of what can be called a Keynesian instrument, at least in infancy, that will possibly be developed in a major way, so that the EU will develop a fiscal framework in addition to the central bank and the single currency that is much more akin to what you know in the States. This has been a 30-year debate, actually, with two major protagonists. France, on the one side, in 1990, was the major force, along with Italy, behind the drive for what is now the euro. The demand of the French government was made very, very clearly at the period of German unification in 1990-91, that the EU required what was called economic government. It would now be called economic governance. It was a description, if you like, of the need of a very large fiscal base to recycle funds to parts of the EU federation. This was, of course, the idea that would be in recession, and the model again was the United States. The German Bundesbank, the former independent central bank of Germany, said nine. That's not going to happen. All member states must be responsible for their own fiscal balances and cannot be bailed out, a famous no bailout clause in what was the Maastricht Treaty. Now, right through the crisis, since 2008, 2010, that battle has become fierce. In effect, the downturn in demand since 2010 in Europe has been sustained by the European Central Bank, in effect, recycling funds off the books, really, outside the legal framework of the Maastricht Treaty, to the countries of Southeastern Europe. Why did they get into problems? Because the main reason is that productivity growth rates, unit labor cost growth rates, are much higher in Northern Europe, or were much higher in Northern Europe than they were in Southern Europe. So Southern Europe, as in fact developing countries should, imported capital, but as soon as the crisis hit, the capital dried up and they became very dependent on what is called the Target 2 mechanism within the central bank for recycling funds to the south. In effect, were they to be independent currencies, they would have devalued. And the German Deutschmark, and particularly the Dutch florin, would probably have revalued to the tune of 40%. Now, this agreement sets the framework for a fiscal union to complement the currency. Those who are ardent supporters of the federal proposal project in the EU have celebrated this agreement as a major breakthrough. There are skeptical voices. I think it's wise for the moment to be skeptical for a number of reasons, just one or two briefly. Italy desperately needs short-term funding. These funds are not going to be available until next year at the latest. The requirement for Italy, because of the coronavirus, is absolutely gigantic. So that the question will emerge whether the financial markets will will raise questions even before it gets implemented. The other longer term problem behind this is that this fiscal deal is that the hardline states, Germany has joined France, I think for diplomatic reason, but the hardline states are Austria, the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, are in the driving seat. So any loans or funds that go to the countries of the South have to pass through their judgment. In other words, I'm not really sure that an awful lot has been changed, but there's politics, of course, involved. What it does mean is that the EU has escaped an existential crisis. Put it that way, you can ask them about that. The other broad point, which I would like to just broach, because I think I've more or less done my time, is that 1990 was a key turning point, of course. What it recorded, I would suggest, is the very strong, the much greater strength of the sense of national identity, let's say in Russia, and of religion, let's say in Russia and in the Middle East, than the ideologies of the 20th centuries, the dominant ideologies of the 20th century allowed for. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the failure of a Western model in Russia. My question I would ask Mike is, China seems to be a sort of outlier in that its political system is Western in conception, but obviously Mao is had a very strong national component. My question I would like to ask others and get some feedback, can the US live in a world where its universal message is going to be listened to in a world of increasingly confident civilizations, Chinese civilization, Russian Slavic civilization, the Hindu civilization? Are we seeing, I'm not suggesting the clash of civilization, I'm just talking about the reemergence of civilizations. I think that's my broad question. One is about the EU, and the other is about the reemergence of, are we watching actually the emergence of civilizations of what would be called in the Western world a sort of multilateral world, a multipolar world, rather than a unipolar world, which I would suggest was a dream of some people in the United States, in Western world, in significant positions in office, but was never really a reality.
Jonathan, thank you very much for provoking us. I'm sure we'll come back to you with a few questions. Let's move on now for just a moment to Mike Lampton. Mike? I think you need to unmute, Mike.
Can you hear?
Yep.
Well, thank you, David. And this should be easy for people to remember names. We got 3 Davids here. So in any case, and thank all of you for attending. And I look forward to your questions and comments. Jonathan just ended by asking about China and noting that the political system there seems to be going in a more, he didn't use this word, but I would, authoritarian direction. On the other hand, its economy, all things considered, has been doing pretty well and has done spectacularly if you look at the last 40 years. So one of the, of course, interesting issues is why is the economy doing so well when we've usually associated freer societies with higher degrees of innovation. We see a tightening society, but a still pretty well performing economy, although the Chinese growth rate's been dropping for the last, still in high growth, but dropping nonetheless. And I think maybe one of the central things to remember about China is that it has really, I think, drawn some lessons and gained confidence about its ability to shape the world. For the first 40 years of reform, Deng Xiaoping basically said, let's get as little involved in the politics and management of the world as possible, and let's focus internally. And this led him to be very, relatively speaking, accommodating to the rest of the world, trying to conform to rules, join institutions, and so forth. This meant that China was frequently criticized for being too passive, for not intervening and on issues, whether it was the Balkans, whether it was the Gulf Wars. China didn't want to get involved. But now a new leader in China has come along, and he looks at all this cumulative growth, economic growth, growth in military power. And he says now has come the time for China to be more active in the world. And he also looks back at the crises that Jonathan just briefly mentioned. There was the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. China came through it in flying colors, basically. Then there was the 2008-9 global financial crisis. And in relative terms, China pumped in massive stimulus and came out of it and grew quite rapidly. And now it looks at COVID. Yes, it made some mistakes initially in trying to squelch news of the pandemic. It wasn't very forthcoming with the World Health Organization. But once it got its act together, it's brought it under fairly great control rather rapidly, certainly compared to the US. So bottom line, when the Chinese look at past history, they say, you know, we haven't done so well or badly, and the United States hasn't done so well. And maybe the United States, democracy, pluralism, lots of NGO activity, maybe this creates problems, governance problems, and maybe our more, some people would say communitarian, others would say authoritarian or even totalitarian. Maybe our methods have something to recommend. So what we see now is economic competition between major firms in China and the United States and Japan and Western Europe. And we are beginning to see an ideological confrontation as well between the United States and China. China's view is that it has built globally competitive industries in the last few years. They would look at their civil nuclear power industry. They would look at high-speed rail. They're beginning to develop aircraft, though they've got a long way to go. But the point is they have an industrial policy. They focus loans, state loans to enterprises. They subsidize research. And there's, of course, an information gathering function to reinforce industry on a global basis. So what has happened is basically the United States, and I believe increasingly our allies, whether they be Japan, Australia, or the European Union, have in effect wakened up to the fact that they face a very strong economic competitor, and indeed in some sense competitor for governance models as well. Now, what I would say is that into this general situation, the COVID virus has exacerbated, at least for the US-China relations, has exacerbated every discontent that the United States has with China. The current administration basically sees China as having not been very transparent, not been fully cooperative, didn't shut down its travel fast enough. And what we have now is a political leader who is trying to use what are widely perceived as Chinese missteps and unfair competition to bolster his political position. Lest it sound like I'm just blaming Mr. Trump, in fact, Mr. Xi Jinping in China himself is trying to use Chinese dissatisfaction with the United States to bolster his control in China. So what we both have right now is a virus that's exacerbating the relationship, and that both political leaderships are trying to use the other as justification for their continued rule. Now, just to wind up, if we look at what this means perhaps for globalization on, and Jonathan asked, well, what are the prospects for the future? I think that it's going to be very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together as it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. We're going to see, I think, not decoupling, although some people see that as possibly quite extensive. But I think what we're going to see is selective diversification of key industries, marginal investments away from China. We're going to see more concern, as we already are in the United States, of concerning Chinese students and researchers and what intellectual property they may be acquiring and how they're acquiring it. And so we're going to be seeing more caution on intellectual exchange, a selective diversification of the supply chains. And frankly, though it pains me to say, I think it's going to be a long, hard slog with the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. We'll be coming back to you with some questions as well. So now let me ask Dave Nagel to unmute himself, and Dave will go through your presentation. Thank you for bringing in a perspective on global energy, which I think is something that is a very topical issue. So the floor is yours.
Well, David, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. David had mentioned the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s, and that event is still shaping how many countries and citizens are grappling with the energy industry. The other historical marker was the Rio Protocol in the 1990s. It started to point to climate change, and some commentators have posed the question: Is COVID-19 a dry run for climate change activity? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address first this perspective from the oil and gas industry by sharing some data. I'm not going to go way back, but I would like to share what's been going on over the last 20 years, and then look at the potential impacts and the implications of COVID-19. David, next slide. So here's something that I've just called the algebra of global energy system, and basically what drives carbon dioxide emissions. And there's not a simple calculation, but the factors that play are population, the economy, the size of GDP, energy intensity, which is the amount of energy required to produce an amount of GDP, and then how much of the market share of energy is fossil fuels. And what you can see over the last 20 years is population has risen slightly over 25%, and all those other numbers in red are bigger than 25%. So the real GDP grew by, almost 3 times. Energy didn't grow quite as fast as GDP, and that's because energy intensity was less over the last over this 20-year period. More shift to the service economy and more energy efficiency. Fossil fuels dropped a little bit more below energy because of the use of renewables and hydro and nuclear, and carbon dioxide emissions fell just slightly, or were slightly lower in growth than the fossil fuels because of a shift away from coal. David, next slide. So that's the world picture, and what I'd like to do is share some data over the last 20 years on these 3 regions, and I'll show some numbers, but I thought I'd start by what are the big themes that you'll see in these numbers. And the first is that over the last 20 years, China's economy really grew, and their energy demand grew by more than 3 times. Whereas the US and Europe grew their economies, but their energy demand was more or less flat. All 3 reduced their coal market share and added renewables, and China also expanded hydro and nuclear supply. But when it came to oil and gas, Europe and Chinese domestic production couldn't keep up with the demands of the local economy. And in contrast, in recent years, fracking, both in oil and gas, has made the US mostly self-sufficient in both of these products. David, next one. This is a way of just showing some numbers behind the growth in energy, and you can see in the bold print between 2000 and 2019, US energy requirements were more or less the same. In Europe, they dropped a bit, and you can see that 3 times increase in the Chinese energy supply. When you look underneath that and see what fuels they're relying on, you can see that both Europe and the United States continue to rely heavily, more than 50%, on oil and gas for their fuels. And both Europe and the United States, coal production fell, and as I mentioned, they also installed renewable capacity. In China, their prominent fuel is coal. It is down in market share from 70% to 58%, but it's still, the major source of fuel for the Chinese economy. And their oil and gas share has stayed as a market share pretty much the same. I want to look at each of the fuels to look at domestic supply and domestic demand. So David, the next slide. Next slide, David. Oh, sorry, you did do it. Back up one, I'm sorry. Yeah, so here, all I really want to focus on is what's shown in red. And in terms of what's happened in the US, it's been a transformation in domestic oil supply, and that's due to hydraulic fracturing, or otherwise known as fracking. And instead of U.S. being able to produce just over a third of its oil requirements, by 2019, the U.S. could produce 81% of its requirements. And that's in stark contrast with Europe, where while the consumption fell some, the ability to supply it fell, and that's because their fields are old, and as fields age, they produce less. And in China, the explosion in demand, they were unable to keep up with that demand in terms of domestic supply. And so both Europe and China are heavily required to go out into the international markets to get their oil. Next slide, please. In terms of natural gas, same sort of question. U.S. has actually become a gas exporter through hydraulic fracturing and has increased its consumption of gas as well, using gas instead of coal, which has pushed down the U.S. emissions. And in the case of Europe, their gas fields are just about as old as their oil fields and are not able to produce as much. And you see a more than tenfold increase in Chinese gas consumption, and there was no way that their domestic producers could keep up with it. And so again, Europe and China are, pretty heavily reliant on foreign sources of oil, of gas as well as oil. And I'd just like to spend just a moment or two, where does it all come from? The Middle East is the largest producer, and China takes more than Europe. I have to confess, there's a gremlin in these numbers, and the number should be about twice what you see there. So China took about 24% of Middle East oil, and Europe took about 11% of Middle East oil, US not so much. In the case of Russia and Africa, and more due to history and geographical proximity, Europe is the bigger customer for those areas than China is, but both are large customers, whereas the US is again a minor customer of Russia and Africa. And in Latin America, China is even a bigger buyer than the United States, even though it's on the US doorstep. US, in terms of where it really gets its oil and gas, is from Canada and Mexico. Okay, so that's a little bit of the backdrop. And now what I'd like to go to is one question, which, next slide, please. Which really is, what is the future of fracking in the United States? So the U.S. oil and gas fracking companies started the year in pretty fragile shape. They had high levels of debt, and there was already an oversupply of oil and gas. And then the Russians decided to have a price war to try to knock them out of business. And then COVID came and created a 30% collapse in demand as people started driving a lot less, and airplanes were more or less grounded. U.S. oil prices actually went below zero on a trading floor basis in April. Some of you may have seen that. But they still are only about $40 a barrel, which is down a third from 2019 levels. And gas prices are also down a third. What you're seeing in the U.S. is fields are being shut in, companies are going bankrupt. There are consolidations where larger companies like Chevron are buying out high debt laden companies like Noble Energy. And so there's a lot of pressure in the U.S. oil and gas business. And this leads to three interesting questions. One is, have we seen peak fracking in the United States? And second is, if domestic production falls permanently, how is the U.S. going to replace these supply lines, and with which fuels? And finally, if this fall in U.S. production is large enough, how will it affect the supply lines for Europe and China? So that's that on that side of it. The other thing I'd like to talk about is carbon dioxide emissions. And you saw in an earlier slide that carbon dioxide emissions have risen 44% over the last 20 years. This is a whodunit slide. So China is the largest emitter, followed by the US and India. And you can see the others, and the top 20 countries represent 80% of the CO2 emissions. But if you look at it on a per capita basis, which is the slide to the right, China and India are the lower two of the emitters on a per capita basis out of these 6 countries that you see. Now, there's no question with the reduction in oil demand and the slowdown in the economies globally, CO2 emissions in 2020 will be less than 2019. And, you kind of got to believe that that's going to continue until a reliable vaccine is made available. But there is a question about, well, what is the story of COVID-19 signal for how the world is going to cope with CO2 emissions? And this is my last slide. David Gauci and I have been looking at some scenarios in our work. And we look out to 2050 in a world where there's likely to be 10 billion people. And we say, well, let's pick a scenario. And this one is called business as expected, which is a focus on incremental innovation. And that's innovation in technology for sure, but also innovation in market forces and in government, national government policies. In each case, the 30-year growth in real GDP is less than the 20-year growth. Sorry, David?
Sorry.
No? That may be the hook, but I'm not going to quite take it. So anyway, the 30-year growth in GDP is actually less than the 20-year growth of the previous 20 years. And so it goes through this slide. And in this scenario, I mean, it's not bad. Fossil fuels are 57% of total energy, whereas right now they're about 84, 85%. But it's still a lot of fossil fuels. And so the question here is, can the acceleration in the transformation in energy, the reduction in fossil fuels be accelerated? And the answer to this question is a maybe. Maybe through more global cooperation. But so far, for the most part, the pandemic has illustrated a focus on national interests rather than global cooperation. And I just have to ask the question, will CO2 be any different? So that's it from me, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. One quick question, it just may be a typo, but question coming from Sasha Nick. If the per capita emissions are expressed in tons or megatons, he's hoping it's not megatons.
It's in millions of tons.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
Per capita, okay.
Oh, sorry. It's in tons per capita on the per capita number.
That might make me feel better, okay.
Yeah.
I have a quick question on the energy side of things, and kind of reflects what Jonathan was kind of pushing at. There are trends right now that actually predate the onset of the pandemic, but the pandemic may be exacerbating some of this. So with respect to coal, for example, is there some kind of realignment that's taking place in the global industry for coal? Maybe for two causes. One would be European states like Germany that have been very aggressive, Germany in particular, in its Energiewende, to try to transition to renewables integrated into the power grid, and closing its coal mines, but still needing to generate a lot of kilowatt hours in the process. That's one problem. The other problem is, or issue, is China's continued building out of its infrastructure. Both places have demand for coal. China obviously would need coal for steel production, for example. So do you see anything that's sort of unfolding into the future that may relate to this kind of, these trends that are kind of independent of the pandemic?
Well, it's a great question and it's hard to untangle, but let me just offer a couple different thoughts. Coal is used pretty heavily in the power sector and it is hung in there at about 40%, plus or minus globally for a long time. So, and that's even with natural gas being at low prices, and that's even with renewables coming in. One of the reasons for that is for a lot of countries, you talk about energy independence, which the U.S. has talked about for a long time. Coal is a country's energy independence, and India has a lot of it, Indonesia has a lot of it, Australia exports a lot of it, and so on. So does China have a lot of it. So I think that factor is at play. And then there's the local environmental impacts that the U.S. has dealt with, whether it's acid rain or particle emissions or so on, where some countries will start to get to the stage and say, look, not only would we like to address our CO2 issues, but we'd actually like to clean up our local air pollution.
Right. Okay.
David?
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I just comment on one thing here? And that is, I think when we look at China, it's reducing the percentage of its total energy consumption that is coal. It has been going down, as the charts show. I think one of the interesting things, though, is that, you know, China, like everybody else, can operate inconsistently with your climate change goals. So at the same time that its consumption domestically, so to speak, of its total energy mix, coal's going down, it's exporting coal-fired power plants all over the world as an export item, because different industries involved, employment considerations, other countries, particularly I'm thinking of, you know, Pakistan and so on. Same in the nuclear power industry. And indeed, there was even a time, and I think that deal fell through, was for a nuclear power plant in Britain. So anyway, China's, at the time that it's changing its domestic energy mix, is exporting what you might call industrial products, including coal-fired power plants.
Okay. So Jonathan, I have a question for you too. And before I get going, let me remind the audience that if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. Just send it over and we'll catch it and pose it to the panelists. Jonathan, you talked a little bit about Russia, but I'm wondering if you could go a little bit farther in terms of its relationships with, particularly with Europe, but maybe even more globally in light of what is going on. It seems that during the pandemic, there is a correlated sort of activity relating to the oil markets that has not been entirely favorable for a natural resource-based economy like Russia's. What do you see? You have to unmute. Jonathan?
Okay, hello?
Yeah.
Okay. It's very bad news for Russia because 40% roughly of government tax take or revenue comes from oil and gas, and 80% of export revenues. So they're panting for funds. And in a much reduced financial state. But the interesting thing, I think, is that it's not at all clear that Russia operates just in relation to economic signals. I think a crucial factor is the cultural dimension in Russia. If you don't mind, let me make a little excursion into music. I learned recently to sing, and I've been singing Russian arias. I was at an Oxford Anthony's. They had a Russian meeting, and they invited me, please, to sing a couple of Russian arias. And the pianist accompanying me was a Russian literature specialist from the 19th century. And I was singing a Glinka aria about the Tsar. And my pianist said, Jonathan, do you realize that you're singing Stalin's version of this aria? I said, I had no idea, but you are singing Stalin's version. Stalin followed in great detail everything that was done in high culture in the Soviet Union. But this experience brought to my mind the whole point of the importance of the literature and music of 18th and 19th century Russia, that actually it was so strong, Tolstoy, War and Peace, Mussorgsky's operas and so on, it was so strong that it survived the Soviet Union. It kept it alive. And this is the way I think it kept Russia alive. And that is, I think, the way I would interpret Russia now. It's actually rediscovering via Putin this very curious mixture of the Soviet memory which is very much to do with still the Second World War and the enormity of the Second World War as a memory, and the Russian inherited culture, which is so different to Western Europe's, on which its markets depend, and in many ways is much closer to China's, although it's pretty obvious if you look at the whole problem of Siberia and so on, that China is now enormous and growing much bigger, and Russia is shrinking. I mean, the obvious point would be that Russia should be looking for a deal with Europe, but that was rejected with the expansion of NATO in '96. Many people would argue in the States and in Europe this was a fundamental error which blocked a political evolution and perhaps more importantly a diplomatic evolution of Russia towards Europe. But Russia is in this midpoint, neither Western nor Eastern, but trying to live in between, as it were, uncomfortably, giving priority to the essence of Russianness, whatever that may be, over financials.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, I have one for Mike Lampton. This is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to try it anyway. You and I have a similar experience. We've both been deans in academic institutions, and the pandemic has presented a situation for higher education that seems to be very disorienting for decision makers. It comes at a time after more than a couple of decades of growth in the enrollments of international students in US institutions. And that seems to cut two different ways. One is, it seems that obviously there's something missing here that should be probably represented in the trade balance of the United States, because we've been generating a lot of billions of dollars, actually annually, on the backs of international students who tend to pay full tuition for their American educations. And then the second part of that is that the international students appear to be subsidizing the educations of the American students. How do we grapple with this? It seems like this really might be an institutional disruption that's going to cause academic institutions to think really differently about what they're doing.
Well, David, let me first of all say I think you've hit a key issue, and I think it's just beginning to explode on the consciousness of the broader public, but also American academia. And let me just say, China itself, I'll talk mostly, as your question suggests, about what the US has been doing. But China's, of course, been doing things that are bothersome to the US. And let me just tick off the last couple of days here. China's issuing some guidelines on foreign teachers in China that they have to take sort of a political study group, be more sensitive to Chinese political concerns. In short, tampering with what foreigners say in Chinese classrooms where they're teachers. And this is going to cause a reaction in American academia along the lines of academic freedom and so forth. Let me also just say there are many people in China that want to continue this high level of exchange, freedom of Chinese students to come to the United States and so on. So there is a big constituency in China for maintaining educational relations, even though they seem to be going downhill. Now, to the direct point of your question, approximately each year, the United States institutions of tertiary education get somewhere around $15 billion in trade terms. This would be a service, but it would fit in our trade balance. And that is to say, we have a favorable balance of services and education of around $15 billion a year. We don't know what the enrollment figures are going to be, generally speaking, for certain this coming academic year. But if you, I think some of the guesses I've read is they could fall easily 20%. Now, some of this is because online classes may not be as valued by the market as the, in-class experience. So hard to sort out all of the reasons. But as the COVID crisis has unfolded, China's become a topic, as China's been doing things in Xinjiang and China's west with the Muslims. There's the ongoing Tibet problem. Our FBI director and Homeland Security, the Secretary of State, Defense Department Secretary have all given speeches recently about how we need a whole of society response to Chinese espionage and so forth. There's also, of course, just this sort of anti-immigrant thing that's affecting a lot of this. But it's become a key part of President Trump's re-election campaign is sort of American security broadly defined. China's not seen as consistent with American security, to put it mildly. And therefore it's spilling over into the education realm. And so for the first time since 1978, I think it's fair to say that Chinese students perceive themselves not to be no longer welcome in the United States, or many do. Of course, they've learned a lot about the US and elections and extreme talk in elections and so forth. But this seems more deeply institutionalized in our military, homeland security, diplomatic structure. And so what we're going to see is American educational institutions finding out, just they always knew, but broader society finding out how important Chinese students were in tuition terms. But I want to make one point clear, and I'll end on this, and that Chinese students, and I would say students from India are getting, and South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, are also intellectually important to what goes on in universities. Many American students haven't been as interested as some think they should be in math, sciences, the STEM areas. But India and China and much of East Asia are very interested. And the students they send here are TAs in our classrooms, research assistants. Many stay here in the United States to develop startup firms. And I think we are pretty rapidly going to understand that between the money and the brains, we are pursuing a very unwise policy.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you very much. This is, that could be a panel in and of itself, I think. Here's a question from Preetham Parigi in India. So welcome, Preetham. He asks the panel, while taking a 30-year view of the global economy, it is likely that there could be major shifts in the global supply chain as we know it now. India is likely to be far more aggressive in participating and demanding in global forums as regards terms of trade and its political will to exploit its huge coal reserves, for example. So there's the challenge, the tension between globalization and local nationalism. Comments? I think, Jonathan, you might actually be the first to chime in on this.
Oh, wow. Just briefly, Mike made 2 points that touch very much on the UK, which is the nuclear cooperation with China and international students. Both of those are in trouble because of the Hong Kong affair and because the government is seeking to pull the plug, or seems to be pulling the plug, on the Huawei deal. So I think the same points can be made with regard to the UK, not least because UK funding of universities has moved much closer to the US model over the last decade or so. And that raises the question of, I think, two things. The quality of Chinese education is rising fast. If one looks at the information you can get available, and of course, China, Australia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are pulled into the US-UK syndrome as well. So it may well be that in the longer term, the post-78 export of huge amount of Chinese students to the great benefit of the West is at least slowing down, if not coming to a halt. I would expect India to, over the next 30 years, to become increasingly assertive, and that it's an ever expanding share of the world market, etc. I do think there is a restructuring of the supply chains in Europe. There's thinking about it. The transport costs for relatively low value products like masks and so on is 80% of the final cost from China. So what are we doing importing all of that from China? Why not make it locally? There are all sorts of entrepreneurs are smelling the coffee there. Plus, of course, a very important point, Europe does have its own, in inverted commas, Chinese hinterland. It has the Central Eastern, Southeastern European states where they're members of the EU, they're not members of the Euro, and they get access to European markets. So I would expect, and also in UK, by the way, the Japanese investors have defined Northern England as a developing world, but with a sound currency for the moment and a good legal system. So I think there is going to be a lot of redeployment of supply chains. Will India get a larger share of that? Well, yes, it can't really demand a larger share because I think this is part of the development of the international system. A question to Parigi. I remember talking with you about the China-India relationship, and you were very much in favor of the economic perspective, the opportunities, but the clash on the Himalayas and so on is once again a reminder that there's some very serious contentions between India and China, and it seems that the defense community in India is very concerned at Chinese activities in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and in the Indian Ocean.
So, Jonathan, thank you. But let's, in the interest of time, I think we'll take one more question. It's from Al Arisman, actually. There's a bit of a segue here. He says he thinks he's heard that globalization takes two paths. Trade and supply chains would be one, cooperation around climate change, military, and terrorism is another. Not very much has been said about the military or terrorism component of this cooperation. I would add also, maybe if Al would let me, global crime, actually. So, and I know that, Jonathan, you've thought about this. Dave Nagel has worked in places where he's faced it. And I would be surprised if, Mike, you haven't got a view on this as well. How do you see these?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in quick. I think that what Jonathan said in terms of will it be either great cooperation or total competition or something in the middle. I think that this is going to be a muddle through pick and choose approach, and I think that there are no absolutes on this. But if it's in a country's national interest to pursue cooperation on cybercrime, for example, I think we'd see that.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, do you have a view?
Yes, I think basically speaking, in both China and the United States, the array of security institutions are very rapidly focusing on each other as their principal problem. So in the last few days, for instance, you've seen the US say it's no longer going to extradite people that Hong Kong wants for the fear that Hong Kong will in turn send them off to China to an uncertain fate. You're seeing the FBI here take a lead role in whole of society response to pilfering of intellectual property and security and so forth. So basically, in each country, and China set up a national security commission that's principal aim is to stop subversion and attempts at regime change by foreigners. So as that unfolds and has its own domestic political logic in each country, it's going to be harder for our security, Homeland Security, to deal with Chinese public security and Ministry of State Security. So I think we just have to expect that zone of cooperation is going to be more contentious and less cooperative as we move forward.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I think we're out of time. This has been a wonderful discussion. I think it could go on another few hours, but we don't have the opportunity. But Jonathan, Mike, and Dave, thank you very much for participating. For all of you who are still online, if you would please take a moment to fill out the poll that is just presented. And we thank you all for joining us today. And there are other online events that are coming from the Gabelli School of Business. Pay attention to them. They're all pretty darn interesting. We live in interesting times. Thank you very much for joining us today. Bye for now.